Hi, Barely Sapient here. How well does Bazzite work with just 8 gigabytes of RAM? Well, today we're going to find out. The system tested today is my AMD Ryzen 5 1600AF system with an Nvidia Quadro M4000. I have reduced the amount of RAM from 32 gigabytes to 8 gigabytes, and it's installed on a 512 gigabyte NVMe SSD. One other thing is this is one single 8 gigabyte stick of RAM, so this RAM is in single channel for this test. With RAM prices skyrocketing, even in the used market, because of AI being shoved down our throats by big tech just about every chance it gets, it'll be interesting to see how some of these operating systems deal with only having 8 gigabytes of memory. Now, admittedly, there's going to be some games that just don't work because they require more, like Cyberpunk, for instance, requires 12 gigs. So that's off the table. But what about games that do require 8 gigs or on that edge, stuff like that? How does that going to work in, say, Bazzite or some of these other operating systems? Well, today we're going to take a look at Bazzite, how well it performs with 8 gigs of memory. Bazzite on my main system is a bit of a memory hog, as at boot it used almost 5 gigabytes of memory. Now, it's not much of a problem because my main system has 64 gigs of memory, but is Bazzite a memory hog, and how well would it work with 8 gigs of memory? As a comparison, Linux Mint uses only a little bit more memory after after running for a couple hours, having OBS open, having Horror Games Launcher open, of course, the system monitor itself, having a couple of browsers open, and some windows in the File Explorer. So Mint, with all those open, is sitting at about 5.5 gigs, almost 6 gigs, whereas just on boot, Bazzite was at 4.8 gigabytes of memory used. On a fresh boot, Bazzite did use 3.5 gigabytes of memory when 32 gigabytes was installed. So I had gotten in my head that Bazzite is a bit of a memory hog, but is it really? After making sure Steam doesn't start up on system boot, I restarted the system after installing everything and checked to see how much memory was used. Much to my surprise, it was only 2.1 gigabytes. Still a little high for 8 gig for an 8 gig system, but not as high as I thought it might have been. Older games like Borderlands 2, which require 4 gigs of RAM, will run largely unaffected by having 8 gigs of RAM versus, say, 16 or 32 gigabytes of RAM. So, the first game I tested that actually requires 8 gigabytes of RAM was Rise of the Tomb Raider. And Rise of the Tomb Raider at 1080p high settings scored about the same as it does in other distros on this card with this hardware. This is with 8 gigs of RAM at average 54 frames per second. If I recall correctly, it was around 56 with 32 gigs of RAM just a couple weeks ago on Pika OS. The only thing that's a little bit concerning is maybe the minimum at 9 frames per second. But an overall score of 54 frames per second isn't too bad. So it did okay with 8 gigs of RAM, the system did in this case. One of the things that popped up when testing Rise of the Tomb Raider is that even though I can get Mango HUD to work on a lot of other games in Steam, it would not launch with Mango HUD enabled. Let me just try it again to see what happens if I do it again. It just hangs during the launch process of the game. It might actually, yeah, if I remember correctly, it gets into the menu. Yada, yada, yada. It gives you all the menus, or all the warnings all the time because you're not running the right Linux distro, right? But, okay, with Mango HUD enabled, It just doesn't do anything more. As you can see, my system's pretty much idle. It's not loading anything into memory. It's not doing anything. Tomb Raider is not loading. Rise of the Tomb Raider is not loading. Funny. Now I remove that option and I go back into load the game. Of course, the menu comes up with those same warnings. I really should just, yeah. Game launches immediately. Stray is another game that requires 8 gigabytes of RAM and is fairly challenging. Not quite as challenging as Rise of the Tomb Raider, I don't think. But it does require 8 gigs of RAM, and well, Mango HUD works in that, so that's a plus with 8 gigs of RAM. And this is at 1080p with all settings low except for the textures are at their highest, which is in line with what this card can do. And its frame rate ended up being 59 frames per second for the average and 43 frames per second for the 1% low and 16.9 frames per second for the 0.1% low. And that's about right for this card for this game. So the only having 8 gigs of RAM did not affect this game that much. The next game I tested was God of War, and the settings I used were 1080p for the resolution with the render scale set to 50%. I didn't use FSR because FSR looks terrible in this game, in my opinion. It's better just set the render scale down instead. It works a lot better, in my opinion. And then for the graphics, I set the preset to original. Now, to benchmark God of War, I fought the first boss, or the first big, this guy, you know. Anyway, it did quite well with only 8 gigs of RAM, as it averaged 42.8 frames per second, had a 1% low of 36.6 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 30.8 frames per second during this boss fight. So that's actually pretty good. I think the 0.1 and 1% lows are a little bit lower than they were with 32 gigs, but not by much. It's certainly playable. It's certainly a playable game at this point. So, yeah, they did a good job on this game. And when Skyrim Special Edition, it had no problems running it. I was actually surprised to see that Skyrim Special Edition actually says it requires 8 gigs of RAM. But it does. Anyway, at 1080p on this system with 8 gigs RAM, it scored 59.9 frames per second for the average, 55.4 for the 1% low, and 22.1 for the 0.1% low. So it's like no different from having 16 or 32 gigs of RAM. So the next game that I tested was Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced, and this was at 1080p at high settings, which this card has worked pretty well with, and some other distros with 32 gigs of RAM. So I didn't think it'd be a problem. Now it started off and looked like it was about the same, 30, 35 frames per second, maybe getting up to 40 sometimes. But as you can see, the frame rate has dropped to the teens and then into single digits already, just as I've been talking here. And got to a point where it just stuck at this frame until it crashed a desktop and I got a memory shortage avoided. Steam has been terminated by the Linux kernel because the system is low on memory. Basically, every time I tried to run the game at these settings, it would freeze just like this. And then give me that same memory shortage avoided error message. So I tried the game at the graphics preset of minimum. And of course, At first, it was doing just fine, um, just like it did in high settings. Frame rate was a little higher, of course. Wasn't until I died. And once I died, I noticed that well, you can see the RAM is totally loaded up at 7.7 gigs. It's having difficulty getting to, as it does, it gets you out of the hospital. Now the frame rate's in the single digits. Leads me to the conclusion that GTA 5 Enhanced, even at minimum settings, is not playable in Bazzite with only 8 gigabytes of RAM. Ryzen Zero Dawn has no problems loading into the game. It'll launch. Now, what I did try to do is load the in-game benchmark at first. It gets stuck at this loading, like it's done loading, like the loading bar is done. It just gets stuck and doesn't load. When I try to load a save game, yeah, does fine. Things that looks like it's loading and stuff. It gets stuck, but in a slightly different way. See, the loading wheel continues to move. The bar is full, but it'll just stay at this screen forever. So effectively, Horizon Zero Dawn, which requires 8 gigs of RAM, does not work on Bazzite with only 8 gigabytes of RAM. So Kingdom Come Deliverance is another game that requires 8 gigabytes of RAM, and when it came out was quite demanding. Now, let's see, I'm going to turn Mango HUD on and try to play it. I've tried this a few times with Mango HUD on, and Kingdom Come Deliverance will just not actually load. It'll just stay stuck at this at this screen here. Now, if I go ahead and turn off the Mango HUD, and then, well, I can use Pro Games Launcher in-game show FPS feature. That helps a little, I suppose. It'll launch with that, no problem. Now, this game does take a little while to load. Uh, but as you can see, yeah, that pops up literally, 10 seconds after hitting the play button. And this was with the Mega HUD turned off. It wouldn't get anywhere with Mega HUD turned on. So with 8 gigs of RAM, that's at least 2 games I've counted so far, the ones I've tested, that Mango HUD won't launch. Won't launch with Mango HUD enabled. One was Steam, one Heroic Games Launcher. And then on top of the other games, just not working at all with 8 gigs of RAM, or, getting in game and then crashing somehow. So Kingdom Come Deliverance does seem to work okay, despite it all. But my overall impression with playing games on Bazzite with only 8 gigabytes of RAM is, yeah, you're going to have to play games that require less than 8 gigs of RAM, because it's kind of hit and miss on which games will work at 8 gigs of RAM. If they require 8 gigs of RAM, it might be a problem. The Witcher 3 is another demanding game that requires 8 gigabytes of RAM to function properly. And it'll load into the loading screen just fine, just like some of the other games that I've tried. But it will, if you try to load a save game, it will give you that same error message that you get from GTA 5. Based on the games tested, I cannot recommend Bazzite with 8 gigs of RAM if you want to play games that require 8 gigabytes of RAM. You actually require more for them to work on Bazzite, a lot of them. Some will crash fairly quickly, or some won't load. And some will work, like this one here, Stray, which seemed to work fine. So did Rise of the Tomb Raider. And so did Kingdom Come Deliverance. But GTA 5 would eventually crash. Horizon Zero Dawn wouldn't load. Witcher 3 wouldn't load. And then, of course, games that require less than 8 gigabytes of RAM should do fine. But there are other Linux distros that manage memory better. I would suggest one of those if you only have 8 gigs of RAM and want to play titles that require 8 gigs of RAM. Anyway, I hope you guys liked the video, and I'll catch you in the next one. Like and subscribe if you like the video, and comments are always welcome.